All right, good afternoon, everyone. Like Donna said, my name is Yuri. I'm a digital transformation strategist working for Tricentis for the last 3 years. I've been focusing always on continuous testing. I have a QA background. I've been in consulting also for 10 years, so really started my career with having my hands in the mud. And at some point, I evolved and was like, maybe we need to work on some models to help all these customers out there mature in continuous testing. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So we've developed a model which is called the elements of continuous testing. And before I really get into that, so in this session we're really going into the model and doing a deep dive into the different phases we have, the different phases of transformation, the different phases of continuous testing, because continuous testing is a journey. And for the people that have seen Christian Pleichner's presentation yesterday morning, we offer a lot of tools as Tricentis to help our customers in that journey, making sure that we're taking the right steps. And as part of my presentation today, we're looking at the track and review part of that. The continuous testing journey. If you would summarize it in a nutshell, the model basically consists of 4 different phases. And the very first phase is what we call the innovate phase. It's basically the phase where teams get started with automation, and you're trying to figure out how the wheel has to rotate, right? And whenever you have done that, in the promote phase, it's all about promoting your successes, showing what business value you're achieving, and presenting that back to your organization so you get the additional buy-in from your leadership to be able to scale. And in the scale phase, you're really looking at shifting left your testing organization. And if you have done that right and you have like really a continuous testing across the enterprise established, then you're going to look at the optimize phase, which is really about a build, measure, learn methodology. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I'll go through each of these phases. But these phases together, because this is just a very high-level overview, these phases together form what we call the elements of continuous testing, which is our continuous testing capability model. And with this model, if you look at it, it has a lot of different boxes, and these boxes represent different capabilities you would have to implement to become successful in continuous testing within your enterprise. Okay? So the model is read from left to right. That's the typical approach. However, as every organization is different, it's not a maturity model where we have like a linear progression. It can be that you as an organization want to focus on certain elements first before you want to do other ones. And that's why we created a capability model. So at the end of the day, you still want to have all of this green, but it doesn't necessarily have to be from left to right. And that's something we'll try to figure out today, what it actually means, and how you use it to assess yourself to define like where you stand right now and what your next steps are. By the way, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask that at the end of the session. I'm more than happy to answer that. And otherwise, you can also come to our customer success booth, where our digital transformation strategists are happy to answer. All right, so let's deep dive into that. The innovate phase. Like I said before, the innovate phase is really about getting teams started. It's about establishing your roles and responsibilities, and it's about trying to build a framework that works for your organization. So it's really important that you're going to try out things, and while you're trying out those things, there will be successes, there will be failures, but the most important thing is that you're actually documenting what works and what does not work. Because you will need that later down the road whenever you're starting to scale within your organization. And you don't want to reinvent the wheel all the time, right? So first phase is about driving innovation by starting to implement test automation for UI and API. You want to have a clear test strategy, which I'll dive into in a bit later. And you want to make sure that your tests can run on demand, unattended, so you run them at night, and in the morning you get your results. There are some metrics, and after each of these phases, you will see that there's a transition in what kind of metrics you will actually be tracking in these phases. So if we look at it from a roles and responsibilities perspective, the persons that have watched Brandon's presentation yesterday already on the enablement and guidance might recognize some of these roles. But basically, these roles are the roles that will make you successful within your team when it comes to continuous testing. And there are 3 roles I specifically want to point out to. First role is basically the automation specialist. This is the person that will take care of your day-to-day work on automation, right? He will take care of the design, of the automation, of the execution, analysis, and maintenance of your test automation solution. They are typically within your teams. And then you have 2 roles, which is the automation engineer and the test architect, which is really, those are really career paths. This is really something, you can train them, but it really requires experience and knowledge of how test automation and QA in general works. So this is something that automation specialists can evolve into as a career path, where the automation engineer is really a technical person that will take care of any automation challenges teams will have. And the test architect is the person that looks more at it from a broader picture. He will take care that best practices are implemented. He will foster collaboration across the teams. And he will make sure that he provides the coaching and guidance that is required to get our automation specialists basically effective and efficient. The other elements, test strategy and unattended execution, however, really talk more about the processes around automation, right? So as we probably all know, to get test automation successful, there are a couple of things you need to look at. From a test data strategy perspective, for example. Up front, you want to make sure that you don't necessarily have to fix it, but you at this moment in time, but at least you want to think about where do I want to be at in half a year from now or in a year from now. So when it comes to test data strategy, you really want to think about, okay, what test data are we using for automation? Is it synthetic data? Is it production-like data? And if we have production-like data or synthetic data, are we creating that manual or are we creating that automated? Is it reliable data? Is it unreliable data? And can we reuse our data, or do we have to create something new all the time? And basically, this decision-making process about what kind of data you're using in your test automation solution has an effect on your overall software delivery lifecycle, right? It has an effect on the resiliency of your automation solution. Same is true for your test environment, strategy. What kind of test environment are we testing in? Are we testing in a stable environment or unstable environment? There are a lot of dependencies within the environment. And how much control do we have over the environment, right? Do we know when there are maintenance windows, for example? Or is it a shared environment? Or is the environment specifically dedicated for us as a testing team? All those things, again, have an impact on your automation solution. And then last but not least, the execution strategy around that thing is, how do we execute? Do we execute attended? So basically someone sitting behind the screen watching the automation run, or is our strategy to run our test cases unattended, so run at night or triggered by a build server? Do we run that in series, or will we set up a virtual machine farm in parallel to basically run more tests at the same time? What kind of tests do we run? Do we run smoke tests? Do we run partial regression? Do we run a full regression? How often do we run that? And do we run that scheduled? Do we trigger that manually, or do we trigger that through a build server? And all these things, all these questions are things you would have to keep in mind whenever you're starting with these teams, where you need to start and practice and see what works and what doesn't work, because that's where you're building the framework, right? So this is your testing phase. All right. So for this phase, some metrics you could look at. We have automation degree, so basically number of test cases, how many do we execute manual, how many do we execute automated. This is really a metric that tells you something about progress, basically. So how much progress is our team making to show, like, when we are automating, how much progress are we making? And then from a requirement coverage and risk coverage perspective, there's a maturity there, right? So the first level of maturity would be the requirement coverage. So what you want to do is, instead of reporting on your number of test cases, which basically doesn't really say anything about the quality of your application, the first step in maturity would be to link them to your requirements, so you can actually report on what requirements are covered in our execution of testing and what requirements are not. And then as a step further even, you want to look at business risk, where you basically take those requirements and weight them relatively to each other to really make an educated guess and say like, okay, we have tested the most important functionality of the application, and it's going, and the current build is successful or not so successful, right? So it makes the decision-making process a lot easier. So that's the first phase. And whenever we've worked on the second phase, we've built a framework. And in the second phase, we call that the promote phase. And why do we call that the promote phase? This is the phase where, of course, we're still going to further fleshing out our framework that we have created. But more importantly, in this phase, it's really important that we start to measure our benefits. Okay? So not only just tracking some metrics, but we really want to map that back to what benefits do we bring to the business? What benefits do we bring back to the software delivery lifecycle? Are we testing faster? Are we finding more defects? Is it cheaper to run? Can we run more often, right? So those are questions you want to answer and you want to document. From a technical perspective, so the elements robustness and continuous integration, this is the phase where you're going to look at your false positives. So typically in the first phase, you have set up your automation, you might be running your test cases unattended. However, depending on how you've set up your test data, depending on how you've set up your test environments, you might get still a high false positive rate. And a false positive is basically a test failing for another reason than a defect, right? So if you want to be successful in your CI, if you want to implement your automation solution to continuous integration, you really want to use that as a checkpoint whether my build has the right quality or not, you better make sure that your automation solution is not reporting like errors all the time while they are not errors, right? So you want to build in a mechanism where you're doing a root cause analysis of those false positives, where you're reviewing first where the errors are coming from, right? So is it test data, is it environment, is it an automation issue, did objects change? And if we have reviewed that, then not only how you solve it, but also how you prevent it in the future, right? So it could be that you make your automation more resilient by using, for example, concepts like recovery scenarios or reusable test set blocks, and you add that to your best practices. But it could also be that you need to make agreements with your development team, for example, or that you need to make agreements with your test environment team, if there is any. So you always want to aim for the long-term solution. And if you have done that, you want to categorize and document that, because at the end of the day, you want to share that across the organization. You want to make sure that other teams don't make that same mistake, right? You want to evolve over time, right? So this process is really important and it's crucial because flaky tests basically slow down your software delivery lifecycle. And a robust solution is mandatory for your continuous integration pipeline. So that's why this whole root cause analysis thing is so important. On the other hand, if you look at it from a business perspective, like I mentioned before, you want to make sure that whatever you're doing in testing is visible. And it's visible to other teams, it's visible to your leadership, to your senior leadership, because having a dashboard available that tells you exactly what the quality of your and the current state of your application is, that enables and helps with thoughtful decision making. It helps with the collaboration across the teams, and it increases visibility across the organization. And that visibility, you really need to get the buy-in, right? So we all know that if we're talking about continuous testing, if we're trying to implement test automation in our organization, it doesn't come like all of a sudden, right? It's an investment you need to make. And that investment, to have the buy-in and have the budget to be able to make that investment, you will need to basically convince your decision makers that they are willing to pay for that because they want to see the benefits. And how do you do that? Simply by making sure you track your ROI. So Frank had a session on that yesterday, ROI of test automation, making sure that you track your benefits. You want to create these internal case studies where you're really highlighting like, okay, looking back at the last 6 months, what we have achieved so far, we have saved X amount of costs. We are doing things 3 times quicker, 5 times the quality. We're finding less defects in production. You want to document that, right? And you want to show that. It creates the buy-in. And with that, so if we look at it from a metrics perspective, we really need to, the metrics here obviously are return on investment, right? To track the benefits. It's the false positive rate, and related to that, related to that false positive rate, the false positive rate by itself doesn't say much. But if you look at it, or if you look at the distribution of root cause, what those false positives are and how it's caused, and also if you look at, for example, over time the defect rejection rate and the distribution of test activities, while you're solving these false positives and you're preventing it, you will see a change in your distribution of test activities, right? Because initially you might spend a lot of time on test analysis, and that should go down over time when you're working on these things. So there's a connection between the metrics. And from an execution time perspective, I mean, that obviously ties back into your return on investment as well, right? How often and how quickly can we execute? All right, so third phase. If we look at the third phase, we have received the buy-in because we created our champions, we have created those internal success stories, and now it's a matter of scaling. And while you're scaling within the organization, we already developed the framework in phase 1 and 2. So we want to basically take that framework and publish that across the organization, copy that, and make sure that other teams are implementing that and that they're getting those same benefits. So obviously, what you're doing with each and every team, each and every new team you're going through, those teams will go through phase 1 and 2 again, right? Because those 1 and 2 is something, phase 1 and 2 is really something that you do on a team level. Every single team will have to start again on building up the automation, coming up with their test strategy, making sure that they have thought about how they deal with test data and environments. But while you're scaling up different teams and you're growing as an organization, there are some other aspects that come into play what you need to think about. For example, an enterprise enablement team. So if you're only talking about a couple of teams, with those couple of teams, usually you have some smart guys and they will get the automation to work. But how do you scale that to the organization? How do you make sure that you have reusability across artifacts? Because sometimes teams are covering the same application or the same application landscape. So how do you make sure that there's a reusability of those testing artifacts? How do you make sure that whatever learnings you have from one team, that's actually funneled into the other teams as well, so they also learn from that, right? So this is where the enterprise enablement team comes in. It's basically a shared team that owns the continuous testing strategy of the company, typically also takes care of the end-to-end testing, and really this team it's an enablement team. So it makes sure that all these different teams you have in your organization, that they collaborate and that you have regular town halls and deep dives and hackathons, and they also take care of the best practices and make sure if there are any questions or if a new team wants to start, that we can accelerate them and help them getting started. So on the other hand, because that's more from an organizational perspective, if you look at it from a process perspective, this is also really the phase where you want to look at shift-left testing. You want to find your defects earlier, you want to find your defects faster, because the faster you find them, the earlier you find them in your software delivery lifecycle, the cheaper it will be to fix them, right? So this is also the phase where you're starting to think about introducing concepts like service virtualization, where you're going to do more API testing, where you're really testing your application in a sandbox environment, testing the functionality of your application in a sandbox environment, and really try to fix those defects as fast as you can. And if you look at it from a metrics perspective, then the cost of defect over time should go down, right? So if you look at your defect leakage, you should really find the defects earlier in your process. So from a test effectiveness perspective, which is basically the ratio of defects found in each testing stage, ideally, if you track that, you want to, first of all, make sure that you find the most of them as early as possible. But secondly, what that also tells you is, what if you don't find that many defects at all in the testing stage? What does that tell you? Maybe we don't find that many defects in our system integration testing. That could tell you something about the collaboration between the different testing stages, because maybe there's a lot of redundancy in tests between these different testing stages, right? So this will help you optimize your overall testing strategy as well. Also from a test distribution perspective, so basically how many test cases are we executing in each and every testing stage? If you look at the agile test pyramid, where the unit tests, basically unit tests, system tests, integration tests should be the most amount of test cases. And if you go to the top of the pyramid where you're talking about end-to-end testing, user acceptance testing, which should be the least amount of test cases. If you look at that distribution of how many test cases we're executing in each of these phases, it will also tell you how effective you have set up your overall testing process within, or your overall continuous testing strategy within the CI/CD pipeline. So these are some metrics you're looking at from a scaling perspective, if you're really scaling across the organization. Now, then the fourth phase. And in the fourth phase, this is really adopting the continuous improvement mentality. So we have set up our organization, we have scaled the organization, and teams are working with automation. They're successful. We have shifted left our testing, and now we really want to implement the build, measure, learn mentality. So this is really where you're going to look at, okay, if I make a change to my process, how do my metrics look like? And do I see over time an uptrend or a downtrend in my metrics? And basically, the change that I made, was that a positive or a negative change? And that's basically what you're going to do in your optimized phase. Secondly, what you also do in your optimized phase is basically expand beyond the borders of testing, expand beyond the borders of IT. Because if you talk about, if you saw the talks about robotic process automation, what you ideally want to do is like the guy from Gartner said yesterday, if you have resilient test automation and you have those artifacts created already, why wouldn't you reuse them in production? Why wouldn't you reuse them to automate some of those business processes, right? So that's really something you could look at in the optimized phase as well. We have our automation is resilient now, so let's reuse those artifacts within the business and like expand our business value we're creating with whatever we're doing. So from a metrics perspective, here, it's not really testing metrics anymore where you're looking at, but you're really looking at, for example, lead time. How quickly does it go from a change request really into my staging or production environment? You want to track that over time. What is my overall IT performance, right? So how is my IT organization functioning? And that has an impact on like customer satisfaction, profitability of the company, and employee satisfaction. So how do you track that, and how can you measure that? That's a tough one, right? Because it's a very broad one. So this is really where you look at companies like DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment. They do surveys with the companies to really look at it from that perspective. Lead time really tells you something about competitiveness, right? So how quickly can we deliver features into the business? And time to restore services is something where you're looking at, okay, whenever we deploy our product in the production environment, how long does it take me to get my systems back up and running and have business as usual? I guess we've all been in situations where we had a release weekend, and that release weekend, basically, it was only done after on the Wednesday, right? So those metrics you want to track over time. You want to see them go down. That's really, in a nutshell, what the entire capability model is about. There's a lot more behind it. I could talk for 4 hours about it if I would like. But basically what we have done is we have created a continuous testing maturity assessment. And that continuous testing maturity assessment will help you assess your team, where you stand right now, what the next steps are you want to take, and really track your successes and help you promote that in your organization as well. Basically, based on the elements of continuous testing, it will tell you exactly what you have implemented, what you have partially implemented, and what you still need to implement. And based on that, you can make an educated guess on what you want to focus on next. And guess what? For Accelerate, we have launched a demo version. So if you would like, please go to this URL on your mobile phone. It's a survey, 13 questions. It will assess the first 2 phases of the model. We also have a full assessment, but the demo version is the first 2 phases. And you will get your report.
Thank you, Jori.
All right, thank you.
Great job.